No academic institution will say it openly, but the data has already spoken. Not in a headline, not in a discovery announcement, but quietly, buried across disciplines that rarely communicate with one another. When you line up the oldest geological layers, the earliest archaeological anomalies, the sudden cultural discontinuities, and the deep resets in human population history, something extraordinary appears. 6 breaks, 6 collapses, 6 times when the world as it was simply ended. These collapses are not spread randomly across time. They cluster, they align, they form intervals, abrupt planet-shaping resets that wiped away coastlines, ecosystems, species, and whatever cultures existed at the time. And after each reset, humanity does not start at zero. We restart at a strangely advanced baseline, as if rebuilding from memory rather than invention. This is the detail no one in mainstream history wants to address. Complex knowledge appears too early. Organized society appears too suddenly. Symbolic systems appear too complete. Cultural sophistication reappears too quickly after destruction. It is the pattern of a species that has done this before. Ancient cultures remembered what modern institutions prefer to ignore. They described previous worlds erased by fire and water. They counted ages, cycles, destructions, and rebirths. These were not metaphors. They were survival records passed forward through memory, myth, and ritual. But in the modern age, each field of science treats its anomaly as an isolated quirk. Archaeologists see sudden appearances. Geologists see sudden climate shocks. Geneticists see sudden collapses in population. Historians see sudden rises of complexity. None of them dare place the anomalies on the same timeline. Because if they did, they would reveal the one conclusion our civilization is not prepared to confront. We are not the first. We are the 7th civilization on this planet. This is not a claim. It is the simplest interpretation of the full dataset once the boundaries between disciplines are removed. And if 6 civilizations came before us, the question that matters now is not who they were, but what destroyed them. To answer that, we must look at the one thing the previous worlds tried to leave behind. A pattern. We are taught a comforting lie. The lie says that humanity began as scattered tribes, slowly learning to farm, slowly building cities. A steady, unbroken line of progress from primitive caves to modern skyscrapers. It is a safe story, but it is wrong. When you strip away the textbooks and look at the raw data, the line isn't straight. It's broken. And the breaks reveal a terrifying truth that has been carefully edited out of our history. Before we continue, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel, and how many of you follow these mysteries from every corner of the world. As we move into a new year, I hope it brings you clarity and insight, both for your own life and for the history we are uncovering together. The images here simply offer context. Thank you for being part of this journey. The pattern begins with an impossibility. Why does civilization explode into existence, fully formed, out of nowhere? Look at Sumer. Their writing system doesn't evolve from simple scratches. It erupts. Complex, complete, and sophisticated, appearing overnight. No prototypes, no practice runs. Look at Egypt. They didn't learn to build pyramids by trial and error. Their first structures are their most perfect. Their engineering declines over time, it doesn't improve. They didn't invent their technology, they inherited it. Look at Göbekli Tepe, massive geometrical precision carved into stone 6,000 years before the invention of the wheel. This is not development, this is recovery. It is the behavior of survivors using the fragments of a world that was already destroyed. History is not a ladder. History is a wheel, a grinder that turns and turns and turns. Imagine the last 200,000 years not as one life, but as 7. 7 times humanity rises. 7 times we reach for the stars. And 7 times we are slapped back down, not by politics, not by war, but by the planet itself. A reset. When you layer the data, ice cores, volcanic glass, magnetic reversals, a rhythm emerges. It is not random. It is precise. Every 12,000 years, like a heartbeat, like a clock. The last time the clock struck was the Younger Dryas. Oceans rose, temperatures swung wildly, the world burned, and then it froze. And before that, another strike, and another. A cycle of destruction so total, it leaves almost nothing behind but stone and myths. We think myths are fairy tales. They are warnings. Listen to them. The Maya didn't just count days. They tracked the expiration dates of worlds. The Hindus speak of the yugas, endless loops of creation and destruction. The Hopi say we are living in the 4th world and the 5th is coming. The Greeks wrote of races wiped out by fire and water, different languages, different continents, same nightmare. They were desperate to tell us one thing. It happens. It has happened before. It will happen again. This is the forbidden pattern. If the reset is cyclical, then we are not safe. We are not post-history. We are simply next. The timing of the solar cycles, the weakening magnetic field, the geological markers, they are all aligning again. We are not in the middle of a cycle. We are at the end of one. But if 6 advanced worlds came before us, where are they? Where are their cities, their machines, their proof? The answer is hiding in plain sight. It is locked in stones so massive, so precise, and so impossible that we have spent centuries pretending they were built by copper chisels and ropes. The evidence isn't gone. It is waiting for us, in the world of the stone that should not exist. If there is a place where the truth of our forgotten past refuses to hide, it is carved not into clay tablets or fragile scrolls, but into stone. Stone is our planet's oldest witness. It does not bend for belief. It does not care for academic timelines, and it does not rewrite itself to match the theories of any age. It simply endures, recording the movements of human hands across tens of thousands of years. And when you follow the path of these stones, massive, precise, impossibly engineered, you begin to see a story emerging that is utterly incompatible with the official tale of human civilization. It is a story of knowledge that appears too early, techniques that appear too advanced, and structures that, by every conventional measure, should not exist at all. The first sign of this forgotten story reveals itself in a quiet village in eastern China. In 1992, a farmer in Xi'an decided to drain a small pond on his property in order to create more usable land. What should have been a simple task instead turned into a discovery that challenged the foundations of Chinese archaeology. As the water receded, it exposed a perfectly carved staircase disappearing into the earth. Authorities were called, excavations were arranged, and soon researchers stood inside one of the most astonishing human-made structures on record, the Longyou Caves. 24 enormous chambers, each carved directly from solid siltstone, extend beneath the ground in a feat of engineering that even modern construction companies would struggle to replicate. The walls rise to heights of 100 feet, but what makes them extraordinary are not their dimensions alone. Every surface is covered with identical, parallel chisel marks, spaced so evenly and consistently across millions of square feet that they appear almost machined. There is no soot, no debris piles, no sign of scaffolding, and no record of construction in any historical document. If stone could speak, perhaps it would tell us how 1,000,000 cubic meters of rock were removed without leaving a trace, or why a people with supposedly primitive bronze tools possessed the capability to produce such uniform precision. But stone does not explain. It only shows, and what it shows does not fit the world we have been taught to believe in. Travel thousands of miles west, across desert and sea, and the pattern becomes even harder to ignore. In the ancient city of Baalbek, in modern-day Lebanon, 3 impossibly large stone blocks lie embedded in the foundation of a Roman temple. Each of these monoliths weighs in the range of 800 tons, quarried from a site half a mile away and transported across uneven terrain. Modern cranes, even with controlled environments and advanced hydraulics, would struggle to lift such stones. Yet these blocks are fitted with such precision into their foundation that the seams between them are almost imperceptible. Rome built atop this foundation, but Rome did not create it. The builders are unknown, their methods undocumented, their tools unaccounted for, and their achievement stands as a quiet contradiction to every assumption we have about the technology of the ancient world. The same contradiction deepens in Egypt, where beneath the sands of Saqqara lies a subterranean tunnel complex known as the Serapeum. Inside its long corridors rest massive granite boxes, each weighing up to 70 tons, with lids weighing roughly 15 more. These boxes are not rough coffers carved crudely with stone hammers. Their internal surfaces are so perfectly flat that laser measurements reveal tolerances equivalent to modern machining techniques. The corners are square in a way that defies the tools that ancient Egypt is supposed to have used. Copper chisels cannot carve through Aswan granite. Sandstone pounders cannot achieve such interior smoothness. Even today, engineers struggle to produce such precision without computerized equipment, and yet the boxes exist, silently contradicting the linear timeline of human technological progress. High in the Andean plateau of Bolivia, at a site called Puma Punku, the contradictions become almost impossible to rationalize. Here, enormous blocks of diorite and andesite, stones harder than granite, are carved into shapes that interlock with an exactness more reminiscent of industrial fabrication than ancient craftsmanship. Some blocks contain perfect right angles, evenly spaced grooves, and complex channels that would require ultra-hard cutting tools even today. According to archaeological convention, the people of the region lacked not only metal tools, but also writing systems and wheeled transport. Nevertheless, they produced work that modern engineers describe as baffling. When a team attempted in 2013 to recreate one of the simpler blocks using advanced tools, what they produced fell far short of the original. The ancients, it seems, were capable of feats that our best equipment still struggles to imitate. And these anomalies are not isolated. They echo across continents. In Peru, at Saksaywaman, stones weighing over 200 tons are fitted together with such ingenuity that they lock into place like pieces of a three-dimensional puzzle. Their shapes appear random at first glance, but each angle corresponds perfectly with the next stone, creating seismic resistance that has allowed the structure to survive countless earthquakes. No mortar binds them, yet they remain immovable. The ability to shape stone in this way is not a matter of brute strength. It is a matter of advanced planning, geometry, and tooling, far beyond what the Inca are believed to have possessed. When asked how their ancestors achieved this, the Inca themselves replied that they did not build it, they inherited it. Off the coast of Japan, the submerged terraces of Yonaguni stretch across the seafloor with geometric precision. Flat platforms, steps, and right angles sculpted into a landscape now 40 meters beneath the waves. The official position insists that these formations must be natural, despite the uncanny symmetry and deliberate patterns etched into the rock. Yet if they were built before the sea swallowed them, then they must date back at least 10,000 years, well before any known civilization. In the Gulf of Cambay in India, sonar mapping has revealed the remains of what appears to be an enormous city under more than 100 feet of water. Artifacts recovered from the site date back to 9,500 years ago, predating every established timeline of urban development. It is a city that should not exist, in a place where no city should ever have been. Taken individually, each of these sites is a mystery. Seen together, they form a pattern that is impossible to ignore. These structures are not the product of primitive cultures slowly experimenting their way toward architectural sophistication. They are the fingerprints of a people who already possess the knowledge to quarry, transport, and shape megalithic stone with extraordinary precision. They are the remnants of a civilization that belonged to a previous chapter of human history, a chapter erased not by time alone but by catastrophe. The stone does not tell us their names. It does not tell us their language. But it tells us something far more important. They were here, they were advanced, and they were erased. The question that remains is not whether they existed, but what happened to them, and why their monuments stand as some of the only surviving testimony of their world. To answer that, we must turn to the ruins beneath the water, the drowned cities of the First Age, and the flood that ended everything they built. That is where the story of the forgotten world begins to rise again. If the stones on land already stretch the limits of what we believe ancient humans were capable of, the stones beneath the oceans break those limits completely. It is beneath the water, far from the reach of ordinary exploration, that the traces of the first lost world hide in cold, undisturbed silence. These submerged ruins do not belong to any known civilization, nor do they appear in any of the accepted timelines taught in universities. They belong to a world that existed when sea levels were hundreds of feet lower, when massive ice sheets still covered North America and Europe, and when the coastlines of Earth were entirely different from what we see today. To understand what lies underwater, we must begin with an event in Earth's history that until recently was discussed only in geological journals. About 13,000 years ago, the world changed with a speed that defied imagination. Ice that had taken tens of thousands of years to accumulate melted rapidly. Sea levels surged by more than 400 feet. Entire continental shelves vanished beneath the waves. The event was so sudden that geologists named it not a transition but a pulse. Meltwater Pulse 1A. The flood was global, violent, and catastrophic, and it swallowed everything in its path. If any civilization had existed before that moment, the evidence would not lie on mountaintops or plains. It would lie underwater. And that is exactly where we find it. Off the coast of India, in the Gulf of Cambay, sonar scans in the early 2000s revealed the geometric outlines of a vast settlement buried beneath more than 100 feet of water. The discovery was accidental, made during a water pollution survey. The acoustic imaging revealed long straight lines intersecting at right angles, forming grids and patterns that could only be the foundations of a city. When divers retrieved artifacts from the site, including pottery shards and worked stone tools, the carbon dating results stunned the researchers. Some items were more than 9,000 years old. This would place the city thousands of years before the earliest known urban centers of Mesopotamia. It should not have existed. And yet, on the seafloor, its remains are still there, half buried beneath layers of silt deposited by the catastrophic floods at the end of the last ice age. The same pattern appears off the coast of Japan. In 1986, a diver near the island of Yonaguni stumbled upon what he first believed to be a natural rock formation, but as he explored, he realized the structure had deliberate symmetry: broad terraces, sharp right angles, staircases, and geometric platforms descending layer by layer into deeper water. Marine geologist Masaki Kimura spent decades studying the formation and concluded that it was artificial. He argued that the regularity of its shapes, the carved channels, and the arrangement of the terraces could not have been produced by natural erosion alone. If Kimura's analysis is correct, then Yonaguni must have been constructed more than 10,000 years ago, before rising seas submerged the region. This idea is controversial, not because it lacks evidence, but because accepting it would mean rewriting vast portions of human history. Yet the ocean floor does not care for our reluctance. It holds its own truth. And Yonaguni is not an isolated anomaly. Around Japan, dozens of other submerged structures display similar features: straight cuts, flat walls, and carved steps that suggest the work of skilled hands rather than tides and earthquakes. Further west, off the coast of Southeast Asia, researchers have mapped what may have been a vast land bridge connecting Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines during the last ice age. This region, now known as Sunderland, would have supported large populations and fertile environments. It is here that submerged river channels, terraces, and ancient shorelines hint at human habitation long before these lands sank beneath the rising seas. If a civilization flourished here, it would have been erased almost completely by the floods. The pattern continues in the Mediterranean. Off the coast of Malta, massive stone blocks rest beneath the shallow waters, aligned in rows that match the orientation of the megalithic temples still standing on the island above. These submerged stones suggest that the temple complexes were once part of a much larger network built when Malta's coastline extended far further into the sea. Whatever culture constructed them must have thrived before the rising waters forced them inland. What all these sites reveal, taken together, is not a random scattering of geological curiosities, but the remnants of a global event that ended an era. These drowned cities, terraces, and structures mark the outlines of a world that existed before the flood, a world that had time to build, to learn, to organize itself, and ultimately to be destroyed by forces more powerful than any empire could resist. It is here that the forbidden pattern becomes unavoidable. The sudden disappearance of these coastal settlements aligns perfectly with the end of the Younger Dryas, a period marked by abrupt climate reversal and catastrophic flooding. Ice core samples from Greenland show temperature spikes that occurred within years, not centuries. Sediment layers across multiple continents contain a thin black mat, a mixture of soot, nanodiamonds, and melted minerals that point to a sudden global firestorm. This phenomenon is now widely associated with the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, the idea that Earth was struck by fragments of a disintegrating comet roughly 12,800 years ago. If this impact shattered the ice sheets across North America, the consequences would have been immediate and world-changing. Torrents of meltwater would have rushed into the oceans, raising sea levels and triggering violent weather. The devastation would have been swift, overwhelming any coastal civilization before its people could record what was happening. It was, in every sense, a reset. Not a slow decline, but an abrupt, catastrophic erasure. Yet the people who lived through it, or the ones who came after, did not forget entirely. Their memories became the flood myths of every culture on Earth. Their ruins became the megaliths that puzzled later civilizations. And their most enduring traces are the underwater cities that now rest in silent darkness, out of reach, out of sight, but not out of existence. If a civilization flourished before the flood, its remnants would be precisely where we find them today, along the coasts that existed when the sea level was far lower. The vast majority of human settlement throughout history has occurred along coastlines, where food, trade, and travel were abundant. When those coastlines drowned, everything that stood on them drowned as well. But stone endures, and now, as oceanographers, divers, and sonar instruments uncover more of these submerged structures, the picture becomes clearer. The age of the first lost world did not end because its people were primitive. It ended because nature unleashed a force that no human technology, ancient or modern, could withstand. These drowned cities are the graves of a forgotten age, the shadows of a civilization erased by water, returned only in fragments by the slow shifting of tides. They confirm the deepest suspicion hinted at by the impossible stones on land, that humanity is older, more cyclical, and more fragile than we have ever been willing to admit. But if the flood ended their world, then what did their survivors do next? Where did they go? And how did their knowledge reappear in cultures that were not supposed to possess it? The answer begins not with stone or water, but with the maps of a world that should never have existed. If the drowned cities reveal where the first great world was erased, then the ancient maps reveal something even more astonishing: that someone charted the Earth long before the last ice age ended, long before any civilization we recognize existed, and long before Antarctica was swallowed under a mile of ice. These maps do not belong to the Greeks or the Egyptians or the cartographers of the age of exploration. They belong to an age whose memory should have vanished entirely beneath the floodwaters, and yet fragments of their knowledge survived, passed from hand to hand, scribe to scribe, hidden inside later maps like ghost lines preserved through centuries of copying. The story begins with a man named Piri Reis, an Ottoman admiral and cartographer, who in 1513 produced a world map unlike anything of his time. His map showed the outline of South America with remarkable accuracy. It showed the correct scale between Africa and the New World. But the detail that stunned historians and remains controversial even today was not his depiction of known continents. It was a section along the bottom edge of the parchment, a coastline drawn with precision that modern satellite surveys would later confirm was the exact northern coast of Antarctica. There was only one problem. Antarctica was officially discovered in 1820, more than 300 years after the creation of Piri Reis' map. And even more troubling, the coastline he drew was not Antarctica as it appears today, buried under massive ice sheets. It was Antarctica as it existed at least 6,000 years earlier, when the landmass was partially ice-free. Piri Reis himself claimed he did not discover this information. He wrote that his map was drawn using older source materials, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great, and others far more ancient, inherited from unknown civilizations. These sources were already old by the time they reached him, transmitted through long-forgotten channels, their true origins lost to history. But the Piri Reis map was not the only anomaly. In 1531, a French scholar named Oronteus Phineas created another map showing Antarctica in remarkable detail. This one outlined entire mountain ranges, rivers, and interior features that were completely unknown to the world, until seismic surveys in the 20th century confirmed the accuracy. Like Piri Reis, Phineas also insisted that he was copying from older sources. Then came Gerardus Mercator in 1569, whose famous projection is still used in navigation today. Mercator compiled information from documents so ancient that he described them as the works of a forgotten people. In one of his maps, he included the Arctic as a ring of islands surrounding a central landmass, details that, incredibly, match certain modern geological reconstructions of how the polar regions would have appeared during earlier climatic phases. Then there was Philippe Boache, an 18th century cartographer who produced a map showing Antarctica split into two major landmasses with a water channel running between them. At the time, this was considered ridiculous, a complete fabrication with no scientific basis, but in the 1950s, when ice-penetrating radar allowed scientists to map the continent beneath the ice, they made a shocking discovery. Antarctica is indeed divided into two landmasses, exactly as Boache had drawn centuries earlier. The official explanation for all of this is that the cartographers made lucky guesses. But lucky guesses do not produce accurate latitude and longitude measurements. Lucky guesses do not outline mountain ranges hidden under a mile of ice. Lucky guesses do not create coastal maps that match modern satellite imagery. And lucky guesses do not appear repeatedly across centuries from different cartographers in different cultures who all claim they were working from ancient sources. The only reasonable explanation is the one mainstream history refuses to consider: that a civilization capable of global exploration existed before the end of the last ice age, and that it charted coastlines that would later be drowned by rising seas and sealed beneath ice sheets. This idea, radical as it sounds, becomes more plausible when you consider the geological reality of the late Pleistocene world. With sea levels far lower than today, vast stretches of land now submerged were once coastal plains, rich with resources and ideal for human settlement. If an advanced maritime culture thrived along those coastlines, its cities would now lie deep underwater, out of reach, waiting to be found by divers and sonar instruments. Such a civilization would have relied on astronomy for navigation, perhaps even more than modern seafarers do. They would have tracked star positions, planetary movements, and the slow celestial wobble known as the precession of the equinoxes. To navigate globally, they would have needed precise clocks or the equivalent of chronometers, tools that supposedly were not invented until the 18th century. Yet the source maps used by Piri Reis and others demonstrate accurate measurements of longitude. This single detail challenges the entire accepted timeline of technological development. Longitude cannot be calculated without precise timekeeping and mathematical knowledge. Whoever made the original maps understood both. Some scholars have suggested that this knowledge may have come from ancient libraries, such as the Library of Alexandria, before its destruction. But this merely shifts the question back one step. The library itself must have inherited its maps from even older civilizations, because its founding dates do not reach nearly far enough back to account for an ice-free Antarctica. And so, we arrive at the only conclusion consistent with the evidence, that long before known civilizations emerged, long before Egypt, Sumer, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley, there existed a global culture with maritime capabilities, astronomical knowledge, and mapping techniques advanced enough to chart the world with extraordinary accuracy. This civilization, whatever its name or language, must have operated during the last ice age. Its coastlines would not match ours. Its ports would have been where the continental shelves lie now, hundreds of feet underwater. Its cities, if built on the coasts, would have been drowned and destroyed by the floods of Meltwater Pulse 1A. If its people had foreseen the coming catastrophe, they might have preserved fragments of knowledge, maps, astronomical charts, mathematical constants, hoping that future civilizations could rebuild faster than they did. Fragments survive through time not because they are preserved well, but because they are copied. Scribes do not always understand what they preserve. They simply transcribe the lines. Over centuries, those lines appear again in unexpected places, on the desk of a Turkish admiral, in the library of a French scholar, or in the archives of a Renaissance mapmaker. That is how knowledge from a lost world leaks into the historical record, not as a continuous tradition, but as scattered echoes left behind by a civilization erased by water and fire. And yet, if these ancient maps survived, then the people who made them must have faced the same catastrophe that ended their age. They watched the oceans rise. They watched the ice melt. They watched their world collapse. The maps they left behind were not only tools for navigation, they were warnings. Next, we must ask the question their maps imply. What ended their world so suddenly, and how did they know it could happen again? The answer is not written on parchment. It is written inside our own species, in the code that survived the catastrophe itself. If stones remember what we built, and ancient maps remember what we once knew, then our own bodies remember what we survived. Deep beneath the conscious mind, within the spiraling molecules of our DNA, lies a record more ancient and more honest than any chronicle written on papyrus or carved into clay. DNA does not exaggerate. It does not mythologize. It keeps its memories the way Earth keeps fault lines, through scars. And those scars tell a story of near extinction, genetic collapse, and a moment in human history so devastating that it nearly erased us entirely. Every human alive today, regardless of continent, language, or ancestry, carries the imprint of that catastrophe. Scientists first noticed it not through archaeology, but through something far more intimate, the remarkable genetic uniformity of our species. Compared to nearly every other mammal on Earth, humans possess astonishingly low genetic diversity. In fact, the genetic differences between any two humans are so minimal that two chimpanzees taken from opposite sides of Africa show more variation than the entire human population combined. This strange uniformity troubled researchers. It suggested that at some point in the distant past, humanity did not simply shrink in number. It contracted to such an extreme degree that only a small group survived long enough to repopulate the planet. This event, known now as a genetic bottleneck, implied an existential crisis far greater than anything preserved in written history. Eventually, DNA analysis revealed something extraordinary. Roughly 70 to 80,000 years ago, the human population may have fallen to as few as 3,000 individuals. Some estimates suggest it could have been closer to 1,000. Whatever the exact number, it was small enough that the entire species was balanced on the edge of disappearance. The cause of this near extinction is still debated, but one event stands out: the massive eruption of the Toba supervolcano in what is now Indonesia. The eruption was so powerful that it plunged the world into a volcanic winter, darkening skies, killing vegetation, and collapsing ecosystems across continents. If an early civilization had existed then, its ruins would have been wiped clean, its knowledge lost, its people scattered. But the Toba bottleneck is not the only scar in our genome. There is another, far more recent one that aligns with the end of the last ice age. Around 12,800 years ago, human populations underwent another contraction. Not as severe as the Toba collapse, but significant enough to leave clear traces in mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome patterns. The cause of this contraction correlates perfectly with the Younger Dryas impact event, the same catastrophe that raised sea levels, destroyed coastlines, and drowned cities across the world. In other words, the Great Flood was not a metaphor. It was a survival event, and humanity barely made it through. These two bottlenecks, one ancient and one relatively recent, created a world where all modern humans descend from a surprisingly small pool of ancestors. Geneticists refer to them metaphorically as mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam. These are not individuals in the biblical sense, but rather the most recent common ancestors from whom all living humans inherit specific lines of DNA. Their existence demonstrates something profound. It means that humanity, at least once and possibly multiple times, was reduced to a population so small that a single lineage could become the root of all others. The implications of this are staggering. It means that each time the world reset, the survivors were few. They carried with them memories, skills, stories, and fragments of knowledge. But they also carried trauma, the kind that forces people to focus not on building monuments or preserving history, but on immediate survival. Over generations, the clarity of the catastrophe faded into myth, and the knowledge of previous civilizations dissolved into symbolic narratives. This is why flood myths appear in every ancient culture. They are not independent inventions. They are genetic memories, cultural echoes passed down from ancestors who lived through the destruction. They reflect not a single event, but a recurring one. Every reset leaves an imprint that becomes mythologized over time. The Hopi speak of previous worlds destroyed by ice and fire. Hindu texts describe cycles of destruction called yugas. The Greeks wrote of multiple ages of man, each ending in catastrophe. The Israelites preserved the story of a world consumed by water. The Sumerians wrote of Utnapishtim surviving a great deluge. Different languages, different continents, same memory. But DNA carries something deeper than cultural stories. It carries evidence that the survivors did not just endure, they adapted. During each period following catastrophe, human populations changed rapidly, as if responding to new environmental pressures or rebuilding in the aftermath of collapse. This may explain why technological leaps appear abruptly in the archaeological record. Knowledge did not evolve slowly. It reappeared suddenly because it was being remembered rather than invented. This phenomenon is visible in the dramatic shift from hunter-gatherer societies to advanced megalithic construction at sites like Göbekli Tepe, which emerged almost immediately after the Younger Dryas period ended. It is visible in the sudden rise of agriculture, metallurgy, and astronomically aligned monuments across the world, all appearing without clear developmental stages. It is as though the survivors of the last great collapse had inherited memories they struggled to fully recall, memories that guided them toward rebuilding what the previous world had already mastered. This would explain why ancient civilizations attributed their knowledge not to experimentation, but to instruction. They said their ancestors were taught by gods, sages, or beings who came from the sea. But these teachers, stripped of mythic language, may simply have been the remnants of the previous civilization sharing what little they remembered. And it explains something else too, why we have lost so much. When a population shrinks to a few thousand, its collective memory shrinks with it. Complex knowledge becomes fragile. The mathematical, astronomical, and engineering achievements of an advanced world can vanish in a handful of generations if the people who hold that knowledge die before passing it on. This is how an entire civilization can disappear while its DNA survives. The survivors became the founders of the next age, but they inherited only fragments of the world that came before. Their children learned stories instead of principles, symbols instead of equations, myths instead of engineering, and in time those myths fossilized into religion, legend, and folklore. The oldest memories we carry are not written in books, they are written in our blood. And they tell us that we are not the first version of humanity to rise, flourish, collapse, and begin again. The question that now arises is simple, yet vast. If these memories survived, if these myths endured, and if the genetic scars still shape every human alive today, then what else did the survivors leave behind? The answer lies not in our bodies, but in the stories they carried forward. Stories that all point to the same terrible moment, the flood that ended the previous world. Long before archaeology became a science, long before carbon dating and stratigraphy and ice core analysis, humanity carried its history in the only form that could survive the destruction of cities, the collapse of kingdoms, and the resetting of worlds. Stories. These stories were not entertainment, they were warnings. They were records of trauma so immense that they were preserved across continents, across languages, and across ages by people who understood that their descendants might one day face the same fate. And among all these ancient memories, one story rises above all others, recurring with such universal consistency that it forms a bridge between cultures that never met. The story of the flood. Every civilization that preserved its earliest history speaks of a time when the world was destroyed by water. The details differ in language and imagery, but the structure of the story is always the same. A world that had existed before, a sudden and catastrophic deluge, a small number of survivors, and the rebirth of humanity in the aftermath. These stories do not read like allegories, they read like memories. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians told of Utnapishtim, a man warned of a coming disaster by a god who instructed him to build a great vessel. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood is described as a violent storm that lasts 6 days and nights, wiping out civilization. Utnapishtim survives with his family, livestock, and knowledge, carried in an ark that eventually rests on a mountain. The parallels to later stories are unmistakable, but the Sumerian version predates them by millennia. In the Hebrew tradition, the story becomes the tale of Noah. The details shift, but the narrative arc remains the same. A world filled with people, a divine warning, a massive flood, and a lone family chosen to survive and rebuild. Scholars often treat the Noah story as a religious myth, but its structural similarity to the much older Mesopotamian narrative reveals a deeper truth. These are not isolated inventions. They are retellings of the same ancient event, passed through different cultural lenses. Travel further east, and the Hindu texts tell of Manu, the lawgiver, who was warned by a fish that a great flood was coming. Manu built a boat, tied it to the fish, and rode out the destruction. After the waters receded, he performed rituals to begin the new age of humanity. In Hindu cosmology, floods end cycles and initiate new ones, a concept that aligns perfectly with the idea of repeated rises and falls of civilization. In Greece, the story appears again in the myth of Deucalion and Pyrrha. Zeus sends a flood to destroy a corrupt humanity. Deucalion builds a chest, survives with his wife, and repopulates the world. Some versions describe the floodwaters covering mountains, an echo of events that, in geological terms, actually happened when the last ice age ended and sea levels rose dramatically. Across the ocean, the ancient peoples of Central and South America offer their own versions. The Maya speak of a previous world destroyed by water. The Aztecs describe multiple ages, one of which ended in a flood where only 2 humans survived inside a hollow vessel. The Inca remember Viracocha, who emerged after a great deluge to teach the survivors how to rebuild. The Ojibwe of North America tell of a flood that covered the entire earth, with animals and humans seeking refuge on the back of a giant turtle. The Kawaisu speak of a flood that forced the first people onto a mountain, where they watched the old world disappear beneath the waves. The Haida, the Athabascan, the Cree, all recount memories of a watery destruction so total that it reset the world. The Aboriginal people of Australia, among the oldest continuous cultures on Earth, have flood stories that refer to ancient coastlines that existed during the last ice age. These are not vague myths. They describe drowned landscapes that modern bathymetry has since confirmed, meaning the oral traditions preserved memories of events that took place more than 10,000 years ago. Even cultures isolated by oceans and deserts carry the same core memory. The Samoans speak of a flood that ended an age of giants. The Fijians, the Hawaiians, the Maori all keep ancestral stories of a deluge that reshaped the world. How could these myths, separated by oceans and epochs, all describe the same kind of catastrophe? The conventional explanation is that floods are common across the world, so cultures naturally invented similar stories. But this argument collapses under scrutiny. Ordinary floods do not erase entire civilizations, do not raise sea levels hundreds of feet, do not force survivors onto mountaintops, and do not create memories powerful enough to persist through more than 400 generations of oral transmission. These stories do not describe local flooding. They describe a hemispheric, if not global, event. The consistency of these narratives becomes even more compelling when viewed alongside geological records. Ice cores taken from Greenland show a dramatic temperature spike around 12,800 years ago, followed by violent climatic instability. Sediment layers across North America contain a black mat of carbon-rich material that suggests widespread wildfires at the same moment. Meltwater Pulse 1A raised sea levels so rapidly that entire land masses were swallowed. And beneath the North Atlantic and the Great Lakes region, researchers have found impact proxies, nanodiamonds, magnetic spherules, melt glass, suggesting that fragments of a disintegrating comet struck the planet. These scientific findings align with the oldest stories told by humanity. The flood myths are not fictional allegories. They are eyewitness accounts of the Younger Dryas catastrophe, preserved in the only medium capable of surviving such destruction: human memory. But the stories contain something more than a record of destruction. They hint at survivors who preserved knowledge, who rebuilt, who taught, who carried fragments of a lost world into the new one. In nearly every version of the flood myth, a small group is chosen, by gods, by fate, or by foresight, to survive and begin again. These chosen ones are often described not as ordinary people, but as wise, skilled, or enlightened, suggesting that remnants of the previous civilization played an essential role in rebuilding the next. The flood myths also contain another subtle but recurring element, the warning. They are always framed as stories meant to be remembered, retold, and passed down. They imply that the destruction was not random, but cyclical. They caution that the world has ended before and will end again in a similar manner. Some cultures even specify the number of previous worlds, suggesting that the flood of 12,800 years ago was not the first such catastrophe, but simply the most recent. If these stories survived because they carried warnings, then the next question is inevitable. Who were the survivors passing down these warnings? Were they truly the founders of the first civilizations after the flood, or were they the last inheritors of the world that came before? To answer that, we must look at the myths not of destruction, but of arrival. Not of waters swallowing the world, but of figures emerging from those waters with knowledge that should not have existed. Figures the ancient world called gods. When the waters finally receded and the shattered remnants of humanity stepped into a world reshaped by catastrophe, they did not emerge alone. In every corner of the globe, at the dawn of the civilizations that archaeology recognizes, there appear stories of mysterious figures who arrived suddenly, often from the sea, bearing knowledge, language, agriculture, astronomy, architecture, and laws. These figures were described as gods not because they wielded supernatural power, but because they possessed abilities and understanding far beyond the comprehension of the traumatized survivors they encountered. They were teachers, they were rebuilders, and perhaps most importantly, they were not entirely of the world that had just begun again. They were remnants of the world that came before the flood. The most striking example comes from the ancient cultures of the Andes. Long before the Inca rose to power, the legends of the highlands spoke of a tall, bearded figure who emerged from Lake Titicaca after a great cataclysm. His name was Viracocha. He was described as wearing clothing unlike anything worn by the locals. He carried with him symbols and tools no one had seen before, and he travelled across the land teaching people how to build, how to farm, how to measure the heavens, and how to live with order and structure. Viracocha did not conquer, he instructed. He did not demand worship, he demanded rebuilding. When his work was done, he walked westward toward the Pacific and left by sea, promising to return if humanity ever fell into chaos again. His departure mirrors myths found half a world away. In Central America, the Maya and Aztec civilizations carried the story of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, a symbol often misinterpreted by modern scholars. But hidden behind the imagery is a description of a benevolent teacher, a bringer of knowledge. Quetzalcoatl taught writing, mathematics, astronomy, and agriculture. He opposed human sacrifice and encouraged the development of cities. His teachings were so transformative that later rulers claimed descent from him to legitimize their power. And like Viracocha, Quetzalcoatl arrived from across the sea and eventually departed the same way, promising one day to return. Further north, in the myths of the Hopi and Zuni, a figure appears who emerges from the waters after the destruction of the previous world. He teaches the people how to plant corn, how to perform ceremonies that align with the movements of the sky, and how to maintain harmony with the earth. His knowledge is described as old, inherited from a time before the flood. He is not portrayed as a god in the modern religious sense, but as a powerful and wise survivor of the last great catastrophe. In the ancient Near East, across the ruins of Sumer, the Babylonians told of Oannes, a figure described as part man, part fish, not as a literal hybrid, but as a symbol of someone who came from the sea. According to Berosus, a Babylonian priest writing in the 3rd century BC, Oannes emerged from the Persian Gulf in the earliest days of civilization and taught humans everything they needed to know to rebuild. Writing, architecture, law, geometry, and agriculture were all said to have come from him. Oannes returned to the sea after each day's teaching, as if he belonged not to the new world that was emerging, but to the one that had been destroyed. In Egypt, a similar figure appears. Osiris, often mythologized as a god of death and resurrection, was originally described as a civilizing hero. He arrived during a period of chaos, taught agriculture, established laws, and introduced the arts. His origins were often associated with the watery abyss, and some ancient texts describe him traveling in a great boat across the world. He is paired with Thoth, another figure described not simply as a deity, but as a bringer of advanced knowledge, particularly mathematics and writing. Thoth was said to have written the original Book of Wisdom, containing all knowledge of the previous ages. Across Polynesia, stories tell of tall, pale-skinned teachers who arrived on canoes larger than anything the islanders ever built themselves. These figures introduced new ways of navigating the seas, telling time, and constructing buildings aligned with the stars. In Japan, the ancestral myths describe beings who descended from the sky after the world was remade, bringing with them laws, order, and an understanding of how civilization should function. Though the imagery differs from place to place, the pattern remains. In each of these myths, we see the same elements repeated: a world destroyed, a small group of survivors, a teacher or group of teachers arriving from outside, knowledge restored, not invented, civilization reborn, not created from scratch. Modern scholars tend to dismiss these stories as symbolic metaphors or cultural fantasies meant to explain the origins of social order. But this explanation falters when confronted with their consistency across thousands of miles and thousands of years. Cultures that never contacted one another tell the same story. After the flood, teachers came. They possessed extraordinary knowledge. They built in stone. They measured the sky. And once they had taught humanity what they could, they vanished. These figures are not described as supernatural beings in the abstract sense. They have physical presence. They wear clothing unfamiliar to the locals. They speak languages that need to be interpreted. In many stories, they carry tools or artifacts of unknown purpose. Some even demonstrate technologies that appear magical only because the survivors had lost the context for them. And in nearly every case, the mythology surrounding these figures includes a crucial detail. They belonged to an earlier world. They carried the memory of the world before the flood. They spoke of cycles of destruction and renewal. They understood the stars, the seasons, and the timing of celestial events that mark the rhythm of these cycles. This understanding was not a product of imagination. It was inherited knowledge. The question, then, is not whether such figures existed. The question is, who were they? Were they truly gods? Were they refugees from a distant land? Or were they the last custodians of the fourth civilization, the advanced world that ended in the Younger Dryas catastrophe? If we strip away the mythic language and view these stories through the lens of human survival, a clearer picture emerges. They were people who managed to escape the destruction that drowned their cities. They preserved fragments of their technology, their science, and their philosophy. They made contact with scattered groups of post-Cataclysm survivors who saw in them the wisdom and power of a vanished world. And because the people they encountered had no context for what they were witnessing, they described their teachers as gods. In truth, they were the last echoes of a lost civilization trying to prevent humanity from falling back into darkness. But they did not leave their knowledge in stories alone. They left something else, something far more durable, far more structured, and far more intentional. Systems of initiation, symbols encoded with meaning, and institutions built to preserve knowledge through the ignorance of the ages. To understand what the survivors truly passed down, we must look not at their myths, but at the secret schools and hidden traditions that trace their lineage back to the world before the flood. When the last survivors of the pre-flood world dispersed across the planet, carrying fragments of memory from a civilization that had been erased almost overnight, they faced an impossible task. They had knowledge, but they no longer had the world that knowledge came from. They had methods, but not the tools. They had understanding, but not the infrastructure that once supported it. They were strangers in a new era, surrounded by people who had survived the Cataclysm but had no context for the teachings of the age that came before. So they did what every intelligent, forward-thinking culture does when it realizes that time itself will try to destroy its legacy. They hid their knowledge in plain sight. They encoded it. They ritualized it. They built institutions designed not to exert political power, but to preserve memory. They constructed temples, not just of stone, but of ideas. These institutions would carry forward the remnants of the fourth civilization through thousands of years of upheaval, repression, and forgetting. In time, they became known as the mystery schools. To understand these schools, we must begin in Egypt, the first great civilization to rise after the flood. Egypt did not emerge from a vacuum. Its earliest dynasties exhibit a level of architectural, astronomical, and mathematical sophistication unmatched by later periods. The Old Kingdom monuments at Giza, Dashur, and Saqqara demonstrate precision engineering that suggests inheritance, not invention. The Egyptians themselves said as much. They spoke of the Zep Tepi, the first time, a golden age when gods walked the earth and taught humanity how to build, how to measure, and how to rule with balance. These gods were not divine in the supernatural sense. They were the remembered teachers of the lost civilization, reframed through myth after generations of retelling. The priesthoods of Egypt inherited more than stories. They inherited methods. They guarded sacred mathematics. They studied the movement of stars not for navigation alone, but to understand long cycles of destruction and renewal. They encoded astronomical constants into temple alignments and inscriptions. They preserved initiation rites designed to awaken not faith, but memory. When the Greeks encountered Egypt, they were astonished. The greatest thinkers of the classical world, Pythagoras, Plato, Herodotus, and Solon, travelled to Egyptian temples seeking knowledge older than their own culture. Pythagoras is said to have studied in Egypt for more than 20 years, learning mathematical and metaphysical systems far more advanced than anything taught in Greece at the time. Plato carried Egyptian cosmological knowledge back to Athens, embedding it in his philosophy and in the story of Atlantis, which he said came directly from Egyptian priests. The Egyptians were not the only custodians of this inheritance. In the mountains of Tibet, initiation traditions developed around the idea of preserving non-material knowledge across cycles of destruction. Native American tribes maintained secret societies that encoded astronomical cycles and moral teachings into rituals and symbols. The ancient Druids of Europe studied the stars and maintained oral lineages of teaching, refusing to write their doctrines because writing could be destroyed, but memory, when nurtured through ritual, could survive catastrophe. Across the ancient Middle East, the Hermetic tradition emerged, attributed to a figure called Hermes Trismegistus, a being described as a fusion of the Greek Hermes and the Egyptian Thoth. He was rumoured to be a sage from a previous cycle, a repository of knowledge too ancient and too vast to be confined to a single culture. Hermeticism emphasized the unity of science, philosophy, and spirituality. It taught that the universe operated according to principles that had existed before the flood and that would continue after it. For centuries, Hermetic texts were treasured by alchemists, astronomers, mathematicians, and mystics alike. Even more secretive were the schools that arose during the classical era, such as the Eleusinian mysteries and the Orphic rites. These were not mere religious cults. They were structured systems of initiation designed to preserve understanding about the human condition, the cycles of nature, and the hidden structure of reality. The initiates spoke of profound revelations, of truths that could not be expressed directly because they transcended language itself. Many of these teachings parallel the cosmologies of cultures separated by oceans, suggesting a shared origin. When the Roman Empire spread across Europe and the Mediterranean, many of these traditions were suppressed or forced underground. But they did not vanish. They adapted. They survived through coded symbolism, passed quietly through groups that sought to protect knowledge rather than exploit it. Over time, these groups evolved into organizations known today as the Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, and various esoteric orders. Their symbols, rituals, and architectural knowledge trace lineage back not to medieval stonemasons, as popular history suggests, but to the megalithic builders who inherited fragments of the world before the flood. These groups carried forward teachings about geometry, resonance, proportion, and cosmic cycles, teachings that appear again and again in the oldest structures on Earth. They studied the progression of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis, and the ages marked by the stars. They believed, as ancient cultures did, that the universe moves in cycles, and that human civilization rises and falls according to those cycles. Yet the most remarkable aspect of these mystery schools is not what they taught, but why they taught it. Their purpose was not to elevate an elite class. It was to ensure that when the cycle of destruction returned, as it inevitably would, there would still be people who understood what was happening and knew how to rebuild. This motive emerges again and again across traditions. The Egyptians described humanity as living through multiple ages, each ending in catastrophe. The Hermetic texts speak of the earth purifying itself through fire and water, restoring balance. The Hopi describe 4 previous worlds destroyed by different forces. The Hindus talk of yugas, vast cycles of creation and destruction. The Maya tracked cycles with extraordinary precision, their long count calendar marking periods of cosmic significance. All these systems reflect the same core idea: the world ends not once but repeatedly, and each time there are survivors tasked with preserving knowledge so that the next age does not begin in total darkness. This is why the symbols of the mystery schools are so consistent. The Ouroboros, the serpent eating its own tail, represents the cycle of destruction and rebirth. The pillar symbolizes stability between ages. The square and compass reflect the reconstruction of the world after chaos. The eye symbolizes the awareness that survives even when civilizations fall. If the teachers of the post-flood world encoded their knowledge in myths, the mystery schools encoded theirs in geometry, ritual, and structure. Every lodge, every temple, every initiation chamber was designed not simply as a place of gathering, but as a map of the human condition, a map of the cosmos, and above all, a map of the cycles that destroy civilizations. But knowledge alone cannot prevent catastrophe. For that, humanity needed more than understanding. It needed tools. And so we must now turn to the physical remnants of the pre-flood world, the technologies that were never meant to survive, yet somehow did, scattered across continents, impossible to categorize, and forever at odds with the timeline we have been taught. These artifacts tell a story not only of what was lost, but of what the survivors tried desperately to preserve. When a civilization falls, it does not lose only its monuments or its cities. It loses its tools. It loses the knowledge embedded in those tools, the mathematics that designed them, the materials that made them possible, and the worldview that gave them purpose. What emerges in the aftermath is not merely a cultural reset, but a technological amnesia so profound that even the simplest relic from the previous age can appear magical or impossible. And yet, scattered across continents, buried in sediment, sealed in forgotten vaults, or miscategorized in museums, are objects that should not exist. They are the remnants of technologies from a world older than our own, carried across the threshold of the flood and left as faint imprints of a vanished age. These relics do not fit comfortably into any historical framework. They appear too early, too advanced, or too anomalous to belong to the cultures that inherited them. The simplest explanation is also the most unsettling. They are fragments of the fourth civilization, artifacts that outlasted the Cataclysm because they were built to endure, or because chance preserved them in pockets, untouched by destruction. Consider the so-called Baghdad battery, discovered in Iraq in the 1930s. It consists of a clay pot, a copper cylinder, and an iron rod. When filled with an acidic liquid, it produces a measurable electrical charge. Its existence predates modern batteries by more than 2,000 years. No contemporary civilization should have known how to generate electricity, yet here is an object that demonstrates knowledge of electrochemical principles. Some historians dismiss it as a simple storage jar, but experiments show that it functions exactly as a primitive galvanic cell. It is difficult to accept that a technology as foundational as electricity could appear briefly, be used for an unknown purpose, and then vanish entirely, unless, of course, it was not invented during that era, but inherited. Another enigmatic artifact is the Dendera light, a carved relief in the Temple of Hathor in Egypt. It depicts what appears to be a bulb-like structure emitting light, with figures holding it and a cable-like object attached to it. Mainstream explanations range from symbolic imagery to ritual metaphors, but the resemblance to electrical technology is unmistakable, and it stands in stark contrast to the simple oil lamps believed to illuminate ancient Egyptian chambers. Yet some tombs show no soot, no residue, no ventilation, conditions incompatible with open flame lighting. If a culture inherited knowledge of illumination from a previous age, even without fully understanding it, they might have preserved its symbolic representation long after the actual devices were lost. Then there is the Antikythera mechanism, recovered from a shipwreck off the coast of Greece. It is a complex assembly of bronze gears capable of predicting astronomical positions decades in advance. The device contains differential gearing, a technology not seen again until the mechanical clocks of the medieval period more than 1,000 years later. Nothing else like it exists from its era. Its precision suggests a lineage of scientific development that is nowhere to be found in the surrounding centuries. It is a fragment not of Greek invention, but of knowledge reconstructed from far older models. In India, the Iron Pillar of Delhi stands as another anomaly. More than 1,500 years old, it resists corrosion, despite exposure to harsh weather. Modern metallurgists have studied its composition and concluded that it contains a purity and forging technique inconsistent with the surrounding historical period. The pillar's resistance to rust is not merely accidental, it reflects an advanced understanding of iron processing. It feels less like a breakthrough of the Gupta period and more like a preserved echo of lost metallurgy. Across South America, in the ruins of Saksaywaman and other Andean sites, archaeologists have found strange metallic alloys fused into stone blocks. These metallic clamps, known as T-shaped eye joints, were poured into precision cut slots, suggesting advanced casting and smelting techniques. Yet the cultures attributed with building these structures had no written language and supposedly no high-temperature metallurgy. These clamps appear again in sites across Peru and Bolivia, identical in design and execution, hinting at a shared origin or a technology transmitted from a common ancient source. And then there are the objects that defy categorization entirely. The London hammer, encased in rock supposedly millions of years old. The Koso artifact, a spark plug-like object found inside a geode. The carefully machined stone spheres of Costa Rica, nearly perfect in geometry. The dozens of ooparts, out-of-place artifacts that appear in layers of sediment far older than the civilizations capable of producing them. Many of these artifacts are dismissed as curiosities or misinterpretations, but collectively they paint a picture of a world where technologies emerged suddenly, left brief traces, and then disappeared. Not every relic from the fourth civilization would have survived the flood. Most tools would have been lost. Most structures would have been destroyed. But the ones built of the most durable materials, stone, bronze, iron, had a chance. And some survived not because they were preserved intentionally, but because they were forgotten in caves, buried in layers of sediment, or embedded within ruins later misattributed. But these artifacts tell only half the story. The other half is found in the knowledge encoded in the oldest monuments. The precision of the Great Pyramid's alignment to true north within a fraction of a degree. The astronomical purpose of Stonehenge perfectly predicting solstices. The layout of Teotihuacan matching the orbits of planets. The colossal Olmec heads depicting faces unlike any known indigenous populations. These were not the products of isolated cultures. They were the products of a shared inheritance, a world that had once understood astronomy, geometry, and energy in ways we are only beginning to rediscover. One might ask, if such technologies existed, why were they not preserved in written form? The answer lies in the very nature of cataclysmic destruction. Writing, stored on fragile media, does not survive fire, flood, or geological upheaval. Metal decays. Wood burns. But stone endures. Symbols endure. And knowledge encoded in physical form, alignments, proportions, resonances, survives even when languages perish. The remnants of ancient technology that confuse modern scholars today were likely fragments of a much larger system of knowledge. When the world collapsed, the survivors tried to replicate what they remembered. They carved symbols into temple walls. They built structures echoing the geometry of an older age. They preserved stories that contained metaphors for scientific principles. But the original devices, the original methods, the original tools, those were lost. It is in these remnants that we see the last flickers of a technological world erased by catastrophe. But to understand the tools of the ancient world, we must understand the forces they harnessed. Many of the most enigmatic structures on Earth share one feature. They are built with resonant stone, aligned with celestial events, and placed on telluric currents. They may not have used electricity as we know it, but they used something else. Something derived from sound, vibration, and frequency. To truly understand what the fourth civilization was capable of, we must explore how they moved the impossible stones, shaped the hardest materials, and engineered structures that defy erosion, gravity, and time. And that leads us to the question modern science still cannot answer. How did they manipulate stone as if it were soft clay? The answer lies not in brute force, but in resonance. If the artifacts of the lost world hint at technologies we no longer understand, then the megalithic structures scattered across the earth reveal the principle that may have made those technologies possible. These ancient builders did not conquer stone with brute force. They did not drag multi-hundred-ton blocks using ropes and manpower alone. They did not carve diorite, granite, and basalt with tools softer than the rock itself. Instead, they appear to have used a principle that modern science is only beginning to rediscover: resonance. They understood sound, vibration, and frequency not as abstract ideas, but as forces capable of shaping matter, lifting weight, and altering the physical world. To see this, we must return to the stones themselves and examine not just their size or arrangement, but their acoustic properties. Consider the Great Pyramid of Giza. Beneath its monumental geometry lies a chamber known as the King's Chamber, constructed from massive granite blocks transported from Aswan hundreds of miles away. When struck, these blocks hum at specific frequencies. The entire chamber resonates like a perfectly tuned instrument. Recent experiments have shown that sound introduced into the chamber amplifies in certain directions, creating standing waves. This is not accidental. The proportions of the chamber match harmonic ratios, suggesting deliberate design based on an understanding of acoustic resonance. This principle appears across Egypt. The Osirian at Abydos, built from enormous granite pillars that seem older than the surrounding structures, produces deep bass frequencies when sound reverberates through its corridors. The temple complex at Karnak features columns arranged in patterns that create shifting acoustic effects. Even the Serapeum's massive granite boxes, carved with unfathomable precision, show signs that their interior acoustics amplify and trap specific tones. It is as if these ancient builders were not simply stacking stone, but tuning it. The concept of sonic manipulation becomes even more compelling when paired with accounts from cultures around the world describing stone being moved not by physical force, but by sound itself. Tibetan monks have long preserved oral traditions describing the levitation of stones through the use of synchronized chanting, horns, and drums. According to early explorers and researchers who witnessed such ceremonies, the monks would arrange instruments in precise geometric patterns while focusing sound at a stone, causing it to rise or slide upward along an incline. Most modern scholars dismiss these claims as exaggerations, yet the physical patterns produced by cymatics, vibrational frequencies shaping matter into geometric forms, offer a scientific foundation for such stories. Cymatics demonstrates that sound can organize particles into complex shapes. Sand on a vibrating plate forms triangles, squares, hexagons, and intricate mandalas, depending on the frequency applied. At higher intensities, sound can make water rise, move objects, or even create momentary anti-gravity effects. These are not supernatural phenomena. They are physical responses to vibration. But the ancients appear to have pushed these principles far beyond what we can replicate today. In the Peruvian Andes, the polygonal walls of Saksaywaman reveal another layer of this mystery. The stones fit together so tightly that not even a blade of grass can slide between them. Their surfaces are smooth and slightly convex, as if molded rather than carved. Some archaeologists have suggested that the builders used heat or chemicals to soften the stones. But the more likely explanation is that they used resonance to alter the crystalline structure of the rock. Certain frequencies can indeed change the molecular arrangement of minerals, making them more malleable or causing them to fracture along predictable lines. Modern materials science is beginning to explore these effects, but the ancients seem to have mastered them. Then there is Coral Castle in Florida, built in the early 20th century by a single man, Edward Leedskalnin, who moved multi-ton limestone blocks without machinery. Leedskalnin never revealed his methods, but he spoke cryptically about understanding the secrets of weight, magnetism, and vibration, principles he claimed the ancient Egyptians had known. His unusual tools, found after his death, appear to rely on electromagnetic resonance. The castle stands as a modern echo of techniques that may once have been widespread. Across the world, similar anomalies point toward the use of vibrational technologies. In India, the ancient texts describe the use of sound to build and operate structures, referencing instruments capable of lifting objects by manipulating frequency. In Japan, the walls of certain megalithic sites produce harmonic tones when struck. In Malta, the hypogeum, a vast underground structure carved from solid limestone, contains an oracle chamber where a single voice can resonate through the entire complex, vibrating the stone itself. Modern researchers have measured the frequencies and found that the chamber amplifies sound at precisely 110 Hz, a tone associated with altered states of consciousness and heightened sensory perception. This is not coincidence. This is engineering. The implication is profound. If the ancients used resonance to shape, lift, and transport stone, then the methods we assume they used, ropes, sleds, manpower, primitive chisels, are not only inadequate, they are irrelevant. Their architecture was not simply physical, it was harmonic. Their monuments were not just aligned with the stars, they were aligned with frequencies. This explains why so many megalithic structures share similar mathematical ratios, geometric patterns, and acoustic properties despite being separated by continents. The builders were applying the same principles because they inherited the same knowledge, a knowledge base that was preserved after the flood not in the form of machines, which would have decayed, but in the form of geometric blueprints encoded into sacred architecture. The pyramids, the stone circles, the megalithic temples, they are not isolated achievements. They are pieces of a forgotten science, a science that recognized the universe itself as a web of frequencies and understood that matter could be influenced by manipulating those frequencies. Modern science, ironically, is returning to these ideas. Quantum physics reveals that particles vibrate, that energy fields shape physical reality, that resonance determines behavior at the smallest scales. Sonoluminescence experiments produce light from sound. Acoustic levitation can suspend objects in mid-air. Even the field of metamaterials demonstrates that vibration can alter the properties of matter. In this light, the achievements of the ancient builders appear less like miracles and more like the remnants of a sophisticated technological worldview that did not survive the catastrophe. The fourth civilization may not have used electricity the way we do, but they understood energy in a way that modern civilization is only beginning to detect. Their technology was not mechanical but harmonic, not industrial but vibrational. This perspective reframes the entire ancient world. The precision of the megaliths becomes comprehensible. The impossibly smooth cuts in granite become achievable. The transportation of multi-ton blocks becomes explainable, and the alignment of structures with astronomical and telluric patterns becomes essential, not symbolic. But if the fourth civilization understood resonance and used it to build, the next question is unavoidable. Did they understand the cyclical forces that would one day destroy their world? The answer lies not in stone, but in the sky. It lies in the slow wobble of Earth's axis, in the magnetic shifts recorded in molten rock, and in the solar cycles encoded in ancient myths. It is time to confront the cycle that ended 6 civilizations before ours. Every ancient culture that preserved its memory, every mystery school that guarded fragments of forgotten knowledge, and every monument aligned with the stars pointed toward the same truth. The world does not end by chance. Civilizations do not collapse randomly. Their rise and fall are governed by rhythms older than humanity itself, rhythms written into the movement of the earth, the behavior of the sun, and the silent geometry of the cosmos. To understand why 6 civilizations rose and fell before ours, we must step back from human history and view the planet as a living system, one that breathes, shifts, and transforms across vast cycles of time. Mainstream history sees civilization as a linear progression, but geology tells a different story. Ice cores, sediment layers, magnetic reversals, and the fossil record reveal a pattern of periodic destruction followed by renewal. It is a cosmic heartbeat, a repeating pulse of creation and collapse. At the center of this rhythm lies one of the most profound motions in the heavens, the precession of the equinoxes. As the Earth rotates on its axis, it wobbles slowly like a top about to fall. This wobble, caused by gravitational forces exerted by the Sun and Moon, completes a full cycle roughly every 26,000 years. Ancient cultures knew this cycle intimately. The Maya encoded it in their long count calendar. The Egyptians tracked it through their star alignments. The Vedic texts of India called it the Great Year, and the Greeks later adopted the idea through Pythagoras and Plato. But precession is not merely an astronomical curiosity. It corresponds with dramatic shifts in climate, magnetic activity, and solar behavior. It appears to act as a cosmic metronome, marking the intervals between periods of stability and periods of catastrophe. The most striking of these catastrophes occurred at the end of the last ice age, around 12,800 years ago, during a period known as the Younger Dryas. For reasons that remain mysterious for decades, the Earth experienced a sudden and devastating shift in climate. Temperatures plunged, megafauna died off in massive numbers, sea levels surged, and humanity, already scattered from earlier bottlenecks, faced a near-extinction event. Geological evidence points to a trigger. The Earth appears to have been struck by fragments of a disintegrating comet. Microscopic diamonds, shocked quartz, and melt glass found across multiple continents align with this hypothesis. These materials could only have formed under extreme temperatures and pressures. They are signatures of impact. But the comet was only the beginning. The real destruction came from the Sun. Solar activity is not constant. The Sun moves through cycles of energy output, magnetic instability, and violent eruptions. Modern solar science recognizes cycles ranging from 11-year sunspot patterns to longer-term variations lasting thousands of years. Some researchers propose an even more profound possibility that every 12,000 years, the Sun undergoes a drastic outburst, a solar micronova that releases an immense wave of plasma and radiation into the solar system. If such an event occurred at the end of the last ice age, it would explain much of what we see in the geological and archaeological record. A solar outburst could destabilize ice sheets, trigger global wildfires, disrupt the magnetic field, and accelerate sea level rise. It could destroy electrical systems, alter weather patterns, and plunge entire regions into chaos. For a civilization dependent on harmonic technologies, as we have theorized the fourth civilization was, such an event would be catastrophic. Ancient cultures seem to know this. They encoded warnings of destructive fire from the sky. The Zoroastrians spoke of a cleansing flame that ends each age. The Maya depicted solar serpents striking the earth. The Egyptians warned of times when the sun would rise from a different direction. The Vedas described cycles of destruction by fire and water. The Hopi spoke of a blue star that would signal the end of a world. These are not coincidences. They are memories. The Earth's magnetic field records similar patterns. Magnetic north has never been fixed. It wanders, sometimes slowly and sometimes with alarming speed. Right now, it is accelerating from Canada towards Siberia, moving faster than at any time since measurements began. The magnetic field itself is weakening, a phenomenon that often precedes geomagnetic excursions, temporary collapses of the magnetic shield that allows higher levels of radiation to reach the surface. These periods often coincide with abrupt climate change. When we combine all these indicators, solar cycles, magnetic anomalies, precessional timing, and geological evidence, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Earth experiences catastrophic disruptions roughly every 12,000 years, and every time a civilization falls. The survivors become myth-makers. Their knowledge becomes fragmented. Their monuments become puzzles for future generations, and humanity begins the long process of rebuilding, usually with no memory of the world that came before. If we map these cycles across the last 60,000 years, we see at least 6 major events that could have ended entire cultures. One around 12,800 years ago, another around 24,000 years ago, another around 36,000 years ago, and so on, stretching back into deep time. Each aligns with periods of sudden climate reversal, magnetic disturbances, or cosmic impacts. These were not isolated disasters. They were pulses. They were resets. Each one destroyed a world. Each one erased a civilization. Each one forced survivors to scatter, rebuild, and eventually forget. And then slowly, the pattern repeated. This cyclical view of history explains the sudden appearance of advanced knowledge in early civilizations. It explains why technologies emerge in bursts rather than gradual invention. It explains why the oldest structures on Earth are often the most precise. It explains flood myths, sky gods, and Golden Age memory. It explains why ancient teachers warned that humanity had risen and fallen before. Most importantly, it explains why so many ancient cultures were obsessed with tracking the heavens. They were not simply studying the movements of stars for agricultural needs, they were monitoring the clock of destruction. The precession cycle, the solar cycle, and the magnetic cycle were not abstract ideas. They were warnings. They were the countdown to the next reset. Today, modern science is detecting signals that these cycles may be converging again. The magnetic field is weakening. Solar activity is becoming erratic. Extreme weather events are increasing. Climate instability is accelerating. Sea levels are rising faster than expected. And the ancient timeline suggests that we are near the end of the current cycle. If the world has ended 6 times before, and if the cycle is truly repeating, then we are living in the final decades of the 7th civilization's stability. This is not prophecy, it is pattern. A pattern encoded in stone, preserved in myth, whispered by the survivors of the last age, and confirmed by the data of our own scientific instruments. The real question now is not whether the cycle will repeat, but what humanity has inherited from those who came before, and whether we understand enough to survive what is coming. To answer that, we must look at what the previous world passed down to us and why we are the culmination of a long chain of forgotten civilizations. If 6 civilizations rose before us and were each erased by forces far beyond their control, then our own age, the 7th, is not an isolated achievement, but the latest chapter in a story far older than we have allowed ourselves to imagine. We stand on the shoulders of the forgotten. We build our cities atop their ruins. We rediscover their mathematics, their astronomy, their engineering, their science, and their philosophy, often believing ourselves to be the first to conceive of such ideas. But the truth, written in stone, preserved in myth, encoded in symbols, and hidden in the anomalies of archaeology, tells a different story. Our civilization did not begin from nothing. It began from ash. The survivors of the 6th age emerged into a world transformed by catastrophe. Sea levels had risen, coastlines had vanished, forests and deserts had shifted. The climate was unstable. The sky itself may have looked different, coloured by dust, ash, and atmospheric disruption. The survivors did not step into an empty world. They stepped into the ruins of one. Their first task was not invention, but recollection, remembering fragments of knowledge carried through the trauma of the reset. This is why the earlier civilizations of our age appear suddenly, with no clear developmental timeline. Sumer did not evolve writing over millennia, it appears fully formed. Egypt did not slowly refine its architectural skills. Its earliest monuments remain the most precise. The Indus Valley did not gradually develop urban planning. It emerges with advanced drainage systems and standardized measures. These cultures inherited ideas from ancestors who survived the catastrophe of the previous world. But inheritance is not the same as continuity. Knowledge passed imperfectly across generations becomes distorted. Skills once understood intuitively become ritualized. Principles that were once scientific become spiritualized. Technologies once commonplace become mythical. This is the tragedy of the resets. We inherit the shadows but not the substance. Consider megalithic architecture. The survivors remembered that stone could endure when other materials failed, but they no longer possessed the harmonic technologies to shape and transport stone with ease. They remembered the significance of astronomical alignments, but lacked the full cosmological framework that explained why those alignments mattered. They built monuments inspired by the achievements of the world before, but these structures were interpretations, not exact replicas. The Great Pyramid is perhaps the most extreme example of this memory. It is a monument whose precision and engineering surpass not only the capabilities of the cultures that followed, but the capabilities of most modern construction methods. It stands not as the beginning of Egyptian civilization, but as a relic of knowledge inherited from an earlier age. The Egyptians themselves never claimed to have built it. They claim to have restored it. Across the world, similar patterns appear. The Olmecs, the Maya, the Inca, the ancient Chinese, the Japanese, the Polynesians, all tell stories of ancestors who came from a world before, whose knowledge seemed almost supernatural. Yet these ancestors were not gods. They were survivors, human beings who had retained fragments of scientific understanding, fragments that later cultures turned into myth. What did we inherit from them? More than we realize. We inherited mathematics encoded in the proportions of temples. We inherited astronomy encoded in mythic cycles. We inherited calendars calibrated by celestial rhythms. We inherited engineering principles embedded in stonework. We inherited navigation techniques preserved in oral tradition. We inherited harmonic knowledge disguised as spiritual chants. We inherited cosmological models hidden in symbolic art, but we also inherited something else, a warning. Nearly every ancient culture describes the world as cyclical. They speak of ages that rise and fall, separated by periods of destruction. The Greeks described ages of gold, silver, bronze, and iron. The Hindus described yugas. The Hopi described worlds ending in fire and floods. The Maya tracked cycles of great cosmic significance. These were not metaphors. They were inherited memories of resets. But somewhere along the way, as our civilization stabilized and grew, we lost the meaning behind these stories. We dismissed them as mythological imagination. We replaced cyclical cosmology with linear progress. We convinced ourselves that history is a one-way ascent, that we are the pinnacle rather than the continuation of something far larger. This loss of perspective may be our greatest vulnerability, because while we have inherited fragments of knowledge from the civilizations that came before us, we have forgotten why that knowledge mattered. We have forgotten the cycles. We have forgotten the dangers. We have forgotten that the world resets not slowly, but violently. We have forgotten that the very planet we inhabit is part of a larger system with rhythms beyond human control. In losing this memory, we have made ourselves blind to the signs. We see the weakening magnetic field and call it a curiosity. We see erratic solar behavior and call it coincidence. We see sudden climate shifts and call them anomalies. We see rising seas and extreme weather and treat them as isolated events. We see the cycle approaching and refuse to recognize its pattern. And yet, for those who know what to look for, the signs are familiar. They mirror the ages of collapse recorded in ancient tradition. They align with geological periods of upheaval. They match the timing of the precession cycle. They suggest that the seventh civilization is living in the final stages of its stability. But not everything is forgotten. Even today, scattered throughout modern culture, are echoes of the ancient warning. Secret societies retain symbols that point toward a coming change. Esoteric traditions preserve teachings about cycles of destruction. Indigenous peoples speak of worlds ending and beginning again. Scientists measure anomalies without realizing they are observing the same patterns that ended previous civilizations. We inherited both the wisdom and the amnesia of those who came before us. The wisdom remains in fragments, in architecture, in myth, in science, in art. The amnesia is modern civilization's belief that such collapses cannot happen again. But the truth is unavoidable. The cycle did not end with the sixth civilization. It did not pause out of mercy. It did not break out of pity. It continues, as it always has. Which forces us to ask the most important question of all. If we are the seventh civilization, And if the cycle is returning, what do the ancient records tell us about what comes next? For that, we must confront the final convergence, the moment when ancient warnings, geological evidence, and modern science meet, the moment when the last cataclysm begins to reveal itself again. There are moments in history when humanity feels the ground shifting beneath its feet long before the actual tremor arrives. We sense it in ways we cannot articulate, in the unease that lingers at the edge of awareness, in the quiet recognition that something is changing, not in the human world, but in the world itself. For the first time in thousands of years, science, myth, geology, astronomy, and intuition are converging. They point in the same direction. They whisper the same message. The cycle is returning. For generations, we dismissed ancient warnings as superstition. We believed ourselves separate from the worlds that came before, protected by our technology, insulated by our progress. But the Earth does not care for our achievements. The sun does not recognize our civilizations. The cosmos does not alter its rhythm to accommodate human comfort. And just as 6 civilizations were swallowed by the cycle before us, we now stand at the edge of our own reckoning. If we step back, the signs are unmistakable. The Earth's magnetic field, our planet's invisible shield, is weakening at an accelerating rate. It has lost nearly 10% of its strength in the last century alone. The magnetic poles are drifting faster than at any time in recorded history, racing toward a potential excursion or reversal, events that have, in the geological record, aligned with periods of abrupt environmental change and mass extinction. The Sun, too, is behaving unpredictably. Solar flares and coronal mass ejections have intensified across recent cycles, releasing bursts of radiation powerful enough to disrupt power grids, satellites, and communications. Yet these small events are only shadows of what the ancient world feared. If the theory of the 12,000-year solar outburst is correct, then the minor flares we see today are the preludes to a much larger release of energy, one strong enough to scorch the upper atmosphere, destabilize the climate, and trigger cascading catastrophes across the planet. The climate itself is shifting with a speed unmatched in human history. Extreme heat waves, unseasonal storms, glacial collapse, and turbulent oceans hint at deeper forces at work. Sea levels are rising faster than models predicted. Weather patterns are becoming erratic. Ancient permafrost is melting, releasing gases that have been locked away for millennia. These are not isolated phenomena. They are symptoms of a system entering instability, much like the Younger Dryas onset that ended the last world. And beneath the oceans, tectonic activity is increasing. The Pacific Ring of Fire is awakening, with volcanoes stirring from centuries of silence. Earthquakes are becoming more frequent and appearing in regions previously stable. The Earth's crust, like its magnetic field, appears to be in motion, responding to forces we do not fully understand. To many, these are merely scientific curiosities, worrisome but unrelated. But to those who remember the cycles, to the cultures who preserved their warnings in stone, myth, and ritual, they are unmistakable signs. The Hopi spoke of a time when the world would be shaken from within and scorched from above. The Egyptians warned of an age when the sun would behave unpredictably. The Vedic texts described a final phase of instability before the turning of the Yuga. The Maya watched for astronomical alignments that marked the transition between worlds. None of these cultures knew each other. All of them told the same story. The cycle approaches like a shadow stretching across time, and humanity, as the 7th civilization, stands at the threshold. We are not exempt simply because our towers reach higher or our machines run faster. The civilizations before us were not destroyed because they were primitive. They were destroyed because they occupied the wrong position in the cosmic rhythm. They were caught in the moment when the cycle turned, and now it is turning again. But this time, something is different. Unlike the civilizations of the 4th and 5th ages, we have access to their warnings. We have their monuments. We have their encoded knowledge. We have their stories. And we have our own scientific tools, satellites, observatories, geological records, allowing us to detect the early signals they once recognized only through the stars and the seasons. We are not blind, not unless we choose to be. The question is no longer whether the cycle is real. The question is whether we will acknowledge it in time to prepare. Preparation does not mean escaping the catastrophe. That has never been possible. What the survivors of the previous ages learned is that the goal is not to outrun the cycle, but to endure it, to preserve knowledge, to protect the continuity of humanity so that rebuilding can begin again. We may not be able to stop the sun from releasing a burst of radiation. We may not be able to prevent magnetic instability or profound climate change, but we can decide what will survive the next reset. We can choose which wisdom we pass forward. We can ensure that the next world does not begin in total darkness. If the cycle destroys, it also renews. Every collapse is followed by reconstruction. Every ending is followed by a beginning. And while the civilizations of the past left their messages in stone and myth, we have the capacity to leave something more. A clear record for those who come after us. A legacy of truth rather than fragments. Because of all the inheritances we received from the previous worlds, their mathematics, their astronomy, their architecture, their myths, the most important was neither their knowledge nor their technology. It was their warning. A warning that we ignored for too long. A warning that now rises like a whisper from the depths of time, reminding us that we are not the first world to stand on the brink, and we will not be the last. The 7th civilization will end, just as the 6 before it did. But endings are not failures. They are transitions. And the measure of our age will not be whether we escape the cycle, but whether we face it with understanding. We are not alone in this moment. We are standing with all the civilizations that came before, those whose ruins lie beneath the ocean, those whose symbols adorn the oldest stones, those whose stories echo across continents, those whose memories live on in our DNA. Their voices are not lost. They have been speaking to us across time. And now we finally understand what they were trying to say. And before we close this journey, if you found meaning or perspective in what you've heard, feel free to like, share, or subscribe. It helps these stories travel farther than algorithms ever could. And wherever you are tonight, I hope you rest well. Thank you for being here and for walking through these forgotten worlds with me. The cycle is returning. Prepare, preserve, remember. The next civilization will rise from what we choose to save today. And they too will carry forward the message. We were not the first. We will not be the last. But we can choose to be more than forgotten.